everyone, happy Friday, and welcome to week 2 of our winter knit along. This is called Let's Hiberknit for a reason. It's hopefully to get us through the coldest spell of winter weather of the year, and we'll be here for 4 weeks with tips, tutorials, demos, encouragement, incentive trivia questions, and a chance to win our grand prize draw. So each week we will have a new winner in our trivia question, which comes at the end of the video after all the tips and tutorials and looking at the pretty colors of yarn and the finished sweaters. So right now I think it feels like about -21 here in Bracebridge. I hope it's a little bit warmer where you are. Feel free to post in the comments, say hello, tell us where you're watching us from, and how you've been doing on your hiberknitting progress since last week. And feel free to ask any questions as we go along. So I wanted to say welcome to our newest knit-alongers. We've got Sarah and Linda joining us this week with their projects. Sarah's doing the Tree Hugger cardigan, and Linda is doing the Felix pullover behind me. And happy hiberknitting to Beth, who just received her squishy mail 2 days ago. So she's ready, probably she's cast on and done her tension swatch. So I'm going to do a quick recap of what we've been knitting and what we've chosen. So project number 1 is the Felix pullover. It's knit top down in a worsted weight pure wool Echo Shetland. We've got all the colors here, and it has very pretty details on the raglan. Instead of the regular make one type of increase, it has a yarn over, so it gives almost like a little petal or leaf design. And then project number 2 is exactly the same, but it's called Felix cardigan. So it has a round neck with an open front. I'll bring the patterns up to show you so you can see who the designers are. Project number 3 is Tree Hugger cardigan. That's knit in our very own locally dyed Muskoka yarn goddess woodland base, and it is a blend of merino with baby alpaca. So it's very, very cuddly, soft, lightweight. It does knit up fairly quick though with a larger needle, and it would be beginner to intermediate beginner level. It is knit from the bottom up, and it is seamed. So you're knitting a back, 2 fronts, 2 sleeves, joining the shoulders, putting the sleeves in, sewing up the underarm, sleeve, seam, and the body seams, and then picking up the front border and knitting that all in one go on a circular needle. And project number 4 is hot off the needles. This is Brioni sweater, and it's knit traditional method from the bottom up, but it is done in the round on circular needles, so there are absolutely no seams. So project number 1, 2, and 4 do require short row technique, which we've posted on our event page. Very helpful video tutorial to walk you through the steps, and this does require the stranding technique, which is following a chart and using 2 colors and stranding one behind the other. So I'll just go over some of the tips for each one of these today. Hi Grace. Grace has done about 12 inches on the body so far. This is the one that Grace has picked in a different color combo. And hi to Rhonda. She is just needing to block her Felix. Okay, so you're almost ready to wear your Felix. That's great progress. Okay, so project number 1 and 2. I'm going to show you what the patterns look like so you'll recognize them if you're looking on Ravelry, and I'll put the links down below. So project number 1, Felix pullover by Savory Knitting, requires 3 skeins to 4 skeins depending on the size, the finished size that you choose. And then the Felix cardigan, also by Sabri Knitting, requires pretty much the same amount, a few extra yards because it does have the front opening and the borders to pick up for the buttonholes. And then we have Tree Hugger cardigan. And Brioni sweater. Brioni sweater is designer Deborah Newton. She is an American designer and quite well known if you are a fan of Vogue Knitting Magazine. She does a lot of designs for them. Okay, so we'll start with all the tips that I can give you this week for project number 1 and project number 2. They'll be the same at this point. So they're going to ask you to measure for the length where you should be dividing your stitches and putting so many stitches on a holder for the sleeve opening, and then carrying on to finish the ribbing at the bottom and cast off. So in terms of measuring, just so we're all on the same page, they want you to measure from the top of the back neck, not the front neck, because that's going to be lower than the back. So you're going to be measuring from the top of the back neck all the way down to and including the stitches on your needle. You have to remember not to measure below your knitting needle. You always want to measure and include the stitches that are on the needle, because that will make a little bit of difference. And you do want to measure flat, not hanging, you know, on a mannequin such as this. But just for demonstration, we'll pretend that this is flat out on the table. So I'm starting at the very top of the center back, and I would be measuring to whatever point I'm at, including the stitches on my needle. And once I'm at the required length, that's when I can put some stitches on holders for the underarm. They suggest you put the sleeve stitches onto just a spare length or a scrap piece of yarn. That's actually a very good idea, because if you put them on stitch holders, then they're forced to be flat, whereas if you put them on a piece of scrap yarn, tie it in a knot or a bow, then you can actually try on the sweater without the sleeves and then decide on the body length. Now I know a lot of you are going to add extra length to the body, which is all part of designing your own custom fit sweater. So I think in general you'll probably want to add 2 inches to the length. So remember to add the 2 inches, but you still have to have the same length of ribbing. Okay, so I'm going to show you what they mean by casting on the underarm stitches. That's just to create a little section at the underarm before you go down into the body. And the best method to do it would be the backwards loop method. Some of you may do a cable cast on for those stitches, or a knitted cast on. That's going to leave quite a heavy ridge on the inside of the underarm. So to make it as smooth and seamless as possible, I'll bring up my sample yarn and needle and just show you the backwards loop. And then they also recommend in the pattern that you bind off or cast off in the Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing when you've completed the ribbing here in your favorite method. So you can just do a Knit 1 Purl 1 cast off as normal, or if you have a favorite stretchy bind off or cast off, then that's a good one too. And another little tip on Felix is when you're rejoining the yarn at the underarm to start each of the sleeves, they'll start you in the middle of the underarm. Just leave a little bit extra length, like leave about 8 to 10 inches of yarn. That might come in handy if you feel later on that your underarms need a little bit of invisible mending, if there's a bit of a stretch stitch in each corner. So don't leave too short an end. So I will just give you a quick demo there on the backwards loop method while I have my yarn and needles handy. Hi Colleen, hi Cindy. Are we getting sound? Is everybody getting sound on the video? We had some tech problems last week. Okay, so this is just a quick demo to show you the backwards loop method to cast on your underarm stitches. Because you're only going to have one end of your yarn to work with at this point. So I just take my left thumb, and it's in the same position that I would have the yarn on my thumb if I were doing the long tail cast on. And then I'm just going under the thumb loop and tighten up a little bit. So you can see that's just 1/2 of the regular long tail cast on. So I come from behind, loop it over my thumb, and start at the bottom and come through. So these make a very, very loose type of cast on stitch, but it's very effective for the underarm because we're going to be picking up stitches in that little edge when we start the sleeve, and there won't be a heavy ridge that's on the inside of the sweater. So maybe practice that if you're not familiar with it on some scrap yarn, and then you can see if you like it better than the traditional method. Okay, so now project number 3, tips that might be helpful. It's always helpful when you have a pattern such as this. This is a textured box stitch, they call it. It looks identical on the inside and the right side, so wrong side and right side. So you may get confused at certain points when you have to do shaping of the shoulders or shaping of the front. So be sure to clip a little marker on, which I've done. Of course, you would do it while you're knitting. Just a little progress marker or something like a safety pin. Clip it onto the right side of the work so that when you're working in the pattern, you can quickly look at it and decide, well, that's my wrong side and that's my right side, so I should be doing part of that instruction now. That works really well too if you're doing shawl knitting, anything that has a reversible pattern stitch. So another tip for the tree hugger cardigan, you have to do some shoulder shaping up here at the top, and that is worked over a series of, I think, 6 rows. So to eliminate the sharp shoulder shaping edge when you start to cast off a new section, we usually recommend that you knit the first 2 stitches together or purl 2 together, depending what your pattern is calling for. So that will round out the sharp corners, the little steps that are created, and make it much easier, much smoother to sew the shoulder seams together. Because at the end, you're going to get a nice slanted edge there. So you don't want to have any extra bulk on the inside. And also when you're doing your neck shaping here, you'll be asked to decrease 1 stitch at the neck edge on every so many rows. So just remember that's a decrease, that's not a cast off. A cast off makes a jagged edge, even though it's just 1 stitch. So decrease always refers to knitting 2 together or purling 2 together. And the rule of thumb is we go with the second stitch. So if the second stitch in the pattern is supposed to be a purl, then we purl 2 together. And if it's supposed to be a knit, we knit 2 together. And that, I think those are all the tips for that project. Yeah, it's very straightforward. There's hardly any shaping. Now for project number 4, Brioni. Okay, so we have a few things to go over on this one. I know quite a few of you have picked this project. So I'm just going to look at the chart with you. You probably are not at the chart yet because it starts after you finish the body, after you finish both sleeves, and then the body and the sleeves are joined. You will actually have a little bit of chart work to do at the top of the sleeve ribbing. So just to go over the different symbols so you know what they mean. So you can see the chart is a 12 stitch repeat, both the sleeve chart and the body chart. Because it's worked in the round, you're always working from the right side of the chart to the left. And all you're doing is repeating those 12 stitches over and over around the entire yoke or sleeve cuff. And they have outlined the medium gray and the light gray color as the main and the contrast color. That's easy to read. And then as you get up to round 28, you'll notice that they have little white squares. Those are your decrease stitches, and you have to watch carefully because one is a knit two together using the main color, and one is an SSK using the main color. So those two little symbols are going in different directions. And then the other thing, if you've never done a Fair Isle chart before, or you haven't done one for many years or decades, the other thing to remember is that those little decrease stitches are repeated for every 12 stitch repeat. We've actually had a few knitters who have in the past made the mistake of only decreasing once, twice, all the way around, instead of decreasing continually those two decreases for every 12 stitch repeat. And then you'll also notice as you get further up the chart that you have a dark charcoal square. That is something that you completely ignore. It's the only way they can put it on the chart to make any sense is it's just symbolizing that that stitch is no longer there. So when you're counting stitches, you just completely jump over the dark square and start at the medium gray square. So all dark squares are completely disregarded on this Fair Isle chart. And the other thing to take note of too is the stranding method. So typically you would not strand one color across the back of your work for more than 3 or 4 stitches, 4 would be the maximum, without catching the float, because you don't want to have these long loops at the back that just catch on jewelry and fingers. I'm going to take this off the mannequin so you can see the inside of the sweater, and then I can show you how far the float should go. So I'll come around this way. And believe it or not, this sweater took 4 100 grams of the main color, and I still have at least 60 grams left. And to do all the Fair Isle, that's 100 gram skein, and I still have about 50 grams left. So it's a very economical sweater, and it doesn't take as much yarn as you would think. So I've left a few ends to sew in on purpose, just so I can show you what to do at that point. So there you can see the Fair Isle. And you just don't want your Fair Isle or stranding to pucker. The blocking will smooth it out nicely, but it just can't do all the work for you. So now on the inside of the Fair Isle, that's what you'll see. So at the most I've stranded across 3 or 4 stitches. If I had to go over 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 stitches, I just made sure that I caught my Fair Isle color over my main color once at the halfway point. And you can see there's a fair bit of stretch there. So you want to make sure that your stitches are relaxed and the floats are not tugged too tight in between. So while I have it inside out, I guess I'll show you how to sew in your ends. If you remember last week I was mentioning when you run out of one ball of yarn, to try and end somewhere at the side. That's your invisible side seam because you're not sewing anything up. So to leave a tail from the new ball and the old ball at the side. And that way it will be less noticeable when you sew in the end. So first I'm going to show you what it looks like on the right side where I've sewn in. I don't even know if you can see that. Okay, so this is my underarm. You can see there's a bit of a crease there from blocking. So if I put my hand in, can you visibly see where I've sewn in the two tail ends as I've joined a new skein? Well, I can't even tell, but with my fingers on the inside, there's a little bit of a ridge here. So that is where the two ends were sewn in, and with proper blocking and soaking and sewing in the tails, it should be that invisible on yours too. So I'm just going to use my gold darning needle, and for demonstration I'm going to use the opposite color, because if I use the same color you won't really see what I'm doing. So we'll pretend that we have two ends and we're at the side seam, and we don't want to knot the two ends together. So we want to take the first end, and wherever there's a bit of a gap, we want to take the right side end across to the left side for sewing, and then of course the left side end goes across to the right side. That way they crisscross on purpose. And all we're doing is focusing on the purl stitch, the inside of the work, and we're following the wave. So remember, we're pretending this is part of the sweater, it's the same color. So I'm going up under the purl stitch and then following the same stitch up one more bar. So we're really taking 2 bars at a time. And then I'm going to come around the top of the purl stitch and under 2 bars, which of course makes a bit of a slant. And now I'm going to come around the base of the purl stitch and under 2 bars. So it's all done 2 bars at a time. Once I get a few, you can see where I'm going. And this way you don't get a bulky seam. And it also will lay flat, but it will stretch. As the sweater is stretched and worn, it has a bit of elasticity. You don't want to sew up and down into stocking stitch. You want to sew horizontally. One direction one end, one direction the other end. And then we can just snip it, no knots. Anything that's a pure wool will knot together. Okay, so I'll leave that in. And on the right side of the work, you should be able to see a trace of the blue color through the green, but it's completely invisible. So that's our tried and true method for sewing in your ends when you're in stocking stitch. Now the next method I'm going to show you is when you're working with ribbing. So you'll see when you finish this particular sweater, number 4, I've cast off in the knit 2, purl 2 ribbing at the very top, and I have a bit of a step there, or a jog. So we're going to fasten that off neatly, and then I'll show you how to hide the end in ribbing, which is very different from hiding it in stocking stitch. So I'm threading up my needle. I've left about a 6 or 8 inch tail end of yarn on purpose. Okay, so before I decide where I'm going to sew in the end, I'm going to go across to my very first cast off stitch, and you'll see that there are 2 bars at the top of the stitch. I want to go through both bars from front to back, and I'm pulling it a little bit tight. You can see there's still a tiny gap there. And then I'm going to finish off with a complete loop by going back through the stitch where my yarn comes from. So it's like a little lasso. We've just started under the first cast off stitch. We've picked up 2 bars, and then we've come back around and straight down and through the last cast off stitch where the yarn was attached to. And you can see it's quite seamless there. And then to sew in your end, you're just going to flip it to the inside of your work, pick the closest knit stitch. You can see that nice straight edge, and start sewing through in a vertical fashion, same direction. So I'm starting on the inside of the knit stitch and sewing always to the outside. So I pick up 1 bar from the inside, sew it through, 1 bar from the inside, and sew it through. You don't want to do in and out, in and out. You have to stay in the same direction because that will lay flat with the ribbed knit stitch and stay completely hidden. And then what you can do is jog over to the next knit stitch and then do the same thing coming up the outside of it, just to give you a little bit extra security, because here we're getting about 1.5 inches. So if we come across and along the outside there, we'll get about 3 inches altogether. So I'll bring that up to the camera a little closer. Okay, so there are 2 different ways for sewing in your ends, and those are tips that you can use on any sweater. Oh, and before I put it back on the mannequin, I'll just point out the beautiful short row technique. This is using the German short row. This is the back of Brioni. You can see the rows are higher at the back after the ferrule is finished, and at the front without the short rows. So just as smooth at the back as it is at the front. So that's using our preferred German short row method, and I think some of you have taken the time to practice it since last week and have decided that that's going to be your go-to method from now on, instead of the old-fashioned wrap and turn. Okay, the other tip I want to give you on Brioni is something that I learned the hard way, because I was probably a few steps ahead of you. I know last week we had chosen to switch our smaller needle 1 size down, just because the ribbing would have been too wide and too relaxed at that gauge. So this is actually done on a 4.5 instead of a 5mm, and the sleeve cuffs are done on a 4.5 instead of a 5. So I decided to do 4.5 at the neck to match, but the neck was far too wide. I cast off, tried it on, and it just looked like it was standing up and it would let all the cold air in. So if you make a note for your pattern to switch to the 4mm instead, just for that 1.5 inch rib section, that will give you a much better fit. It will lay flat against the body and keep the cold air out, which would be great for today. How do we measure the side seam length for body and arm? That's Elizabeth's question. So I think you mean from the underarm, or do you mean on your body? Well, this one we are measuring from where the stitches were picked up. So I have a 17-inch sleeve on the Felix pullover. Now if I wanted to know in advance that that's the perfect sleeve length for my length of arm, I would measure from the back, or you might have to get a friend to help you with this. Measure from the back center where you can feel your spine. Measure it all the way to your wrist bone and have your arm partially extended. So I get a 29-inch measurement. So that means if you were to measure Felix from the center point of the back to the end of the sleeve cuff, then you would want to have, if you were me, I would want to have a 29-inch length. So it's always best to measure from the center back because that's half of our body. You can't really measure from the top of the sleeve or the sleeve cap on your body because you just don't know exactly how far the sleeve falls over the edge of the shoulder before it becomes straight knitting. So that's a good tip for getting a nice custom fit. So have I answered everybody's questions? Oh, I got Elizabeth's question right. That's great. Oh, and congratulations, Elizabeth. You were our incentive ballot winner last week for our trivia. And I think now we're going on to this week's trivia. Oh, over here. Okay, so for this week we need a winner. It's just going to be a randomly picked winner. It's just for fun to get another ballot into the draw bucket to increase your chances of winning the grand prize. So what we're going to do is see how skilled you are at knitting lingo. I'm sure you know all the pattern abbreviations such as K and P and SL, slip, BO, bind off, CO, cast on or cast off. But how well do you know your knitting slang lingo? So what I'll do is I'll put up an acronym, and if you want to comment, just for fun, comment and see how many you get right. And then at the end of the video we'll pick a winner. I think I missed Grace's question. I'll have to scroll back after and I will answer your question, Grace. Okay, who knows what UFO stands for? So this is just in knitting lingo, not in the whole universe. UFO. And of course we should start with the basic. The basic one is KAL, which of course is knit along. And if you're a crocheter, it would be CAL. And I'm going to post all the answers, but I think most of you will know these. So the second one is KIP, kip. So what are we doing when we're KIP-ing? Janet got the first one, Elizabeth got the first one, great. Okay, I've mentioned this one today in my little tutorial of one of the sweaters. This is HOTN. So there should be 4 words to that phrase. Knowing your knitting language is so important so that you can talk in code to your fellow knitters and nobody knows what you're saying. This is a really fun one. OKD. I think a lot of us might have this. And this one is PhD, which of course could mean something else in the real world. We just have a different meaning for it in our own language. And you don't have to get them all. You can just, comment on the ones that you feel you might know. Oh, Tina got this one. Good for you, Tina. That's a newer one that's come along in the last few years. So you have to see Tina's comment to know the answer. And if you're Hiberknitting, then I'm sure you have plenty of this. WIP. You have some type of whip. And this is another new one, which does not mean what you think it does. FART. And this is a really fun one too. Okay, so see how many of those you can get right. I'll post at the top of the video in a few minutes. I'll post all the answers, and then you'll maybe have learned a new one or two. So I'm going to go through the comments after. If I've missed any questions, I'll answer them there. I will post all the tips that I've mentioned today in our event page in case for some reason we have tech problems on this video. I think next week we'll go over more of the finishing, picking up of stitches, doing the seams on Tree Hugger, which are completely different than just sewing in a few ends on these, and blocking. And oh, I did want to mention too on Brioni to think about as you're knitting the sweater what type of collar you would like to have. You've got the option of just the flat crew neck. You could also knit it, because you're going to have plenty of yarn, as you can see, left over. You could also knit it double height, flip it over, and sew it down. So it would give it a bit more body there, and it would be warmer. So that would be the second option. That means instead of doing 1.5 inches of ribbing, you're going to do 3 inches, and then you're going to cast off and use the yarn just to sew the stitches down on the inside of the work. The other thing you could do is just keep on knitting and make a mock neck, which would be about 3 inches straight up and cast off. So then it would be up to here, a little warmer, like a mini turtleneck. Or you could keep knitting up and over to about 10 to 12 inches, and then that would give you a nice classic turtleneck as well. If you wanted a turtleneck that is not glued to your neck, the little tip is you knit halfway up on the regular needle, which would be a 4mm because we're adjusting, and then the second half you knit one size larger. So the first 5 or 6 inches, 4mm, switch to 4.5 for the last 5 or 6 inches, and then it becomes more of a cowl neck. It doesn't feel too restrictive around the neck. It just stands out and gives a bit more body to the garment. So there's lots of choices for finishing this off to your preferred style. This one, I think it looks the best just with the classic crew neck, and this one we have to kind of stick with the neckline as it's finished here. So it's just a few things to ponder as you're knitting along, and I hope you all enjoy your Hiberknitting this weekend, and hopefully it'll warm up a bit when I'm back here next Friday. So hope to see you then at 4 p.m. Thanks for watching.